I rise to speak in opposition to the bill in front of us today. And I want to start out by saying, in addition to all of the many challenges facing our nation, a massive budget deficit and a crippling debt may prove to be the most difficult challenge that we face as a country. A deep structural defect, like the one that our government's accumulated because of these debt levels, not only threatens our long-term economic stability, it darkens the horizon in a way that discourages innovation and investment that we need to spur American jobs today. And moreover, our apparent inability to squarely address the problem in a bipartisan way is a signal to the American people as if they needed more proof that our democracy is not working. And that is as dangerous as any attack on our country. It is a time bomb in our midst, the ticking of which we cannot ignore unless we are comfortable knowing that it will eventually and inevitably blow up on our children. Just last week, a bipartisan group appointed by the President confirmed the seriousness of the threat with a different metaphor, but one equally apt. The President's Fiscal Commission called our national debt a cancer that is threatening our country from within. Whether a time bomb or a cancer, the threat is real, and the Commission confirmed it in the starkest possible terms. The Chairman's recommendations for how to respond were sobering, but in a way they were also like a strong cup of coffee after a serious drinking binge. Americans sat up and listened, and for a few days between the release of the Commission's report and the vote by the full Commission the following Friday, it looked like we might be able to set aside the ideological differences that have poisoned our politics and that we could actually address this problem. It looked like we might be finally able to follow the old adage, when you're in a hole, stop digging. However, the next week, the President announced a plan that he negotiated with Republican leaders to extend the Bush tax cuts across the board, a plan that would add $900 billion to our national debt over the next 2 years. What's staggering to me, Mr. President, is that it took just 4 days to switch the conversation from reducing the debt to adding to it. Just 4 days after the most substantive conversation we've had about addressing the debt, we start arguing about the wisdom of extending tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires that alone will cost $700 billion over the next decade. That's $700 billion in additional debt that the United States, the people of the United States, will owe to China and our other creditors around the world. To paraphrase one of my colleagues, I feel like we're operating in some kind of a parallel universe. Mr. President, central to these questions about tax policy is how to find mechanisms that will get our skyrocketing national deficits and total debt under control. Despite disagreements, our disagreements here and in the other House, I believe that we owe it to the American people and to one another to be pragmatic and truthful about the fiscal challenges confronting us. So I respect and even applaud the President's efforts to reach a compromise based on political pragmatism. But what I respectfully disagree with is the notion that this compromise is based on anything approaching fiscal reality or truth in accounting, which is the point I believe that the chairman of the President's Fiscal Commission, Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson, were making. If I might, Mr. President, I'd like to just remind my colleagues today of the history of the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. Those tax cuts were passed after we experienced one of the strongest economic environments in our history. Those who supported tax cuts for the wealthy believed that because we had begun to reduce our long-term debt, we could afford them. They believed those tax cuts would stimulate our economy further and create millions of new jobs. In the words of then Vice President Cheney, it was a time when, quote, deficits don't matter, unquote. I did not support the tax cuts for the wealthy in 2001 or 2003 for much the same reason I don't support them today. I voted against them as a member of the House of Representatives. Now, I sincerely wish that those tax cuts had effectively spurred sustained job growth. I do. But unfortunately, the next decade saw a decline in our economy like we haven't seen since the Great Depression. Banks failed. Foreclosures reached a crisis point. We were forced to bail out financial institutions, an insurance giant, and the auto companies to keep the economy from crashing further. During that time, real income for average households decreased, and the unemployment rate nearly doubled as millions of workers were laid off. If tax cuts for the wealthy among us were an efficient way to spur innovation and investment, I have to believe that economists would be telling us to continue them. But here's what they're actually saying. Economists of all stripes are telling us that extending tax cuts for the wealthy is one of the least effective ways to create jobs and build the economy. Even some of America's most successful businessmen, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who are among those who stand to gain dramatically from the bill before us, have urged us to prioritize seniors, long-term economic stability, and job creation instead. They know what recent history has shown, that tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires don't help our economy, and it certainly doesn't help our national debt. Just over 1 week ago, I stood here with all of my colleagues and voted to support a proposal that would have followed the advice of economists Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and extended relief to middle-class families. To a family making $50,000 a year, an $800 tax cut could make the difference between paying for daycare or health insurance or a second car so that both parents could work. And as more and more Americans become the first in their families to stand in an unemployment line, I find it hard to explain or justify last week's filibuster preventing middle-class tax relief so that millionaires and billionaires can get an extra six-figure check from the federal government. We've heard all kinds of arguments for extending tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, and we've been told that this bill represents the best deal that we could get in order to bring further tax relief to middle-class Americans. But again, Mr. President, those arguments are based on political pragmatism, not a truthful or objectively measured analysis of the actual impact on our budget deficit. That's why the co-chair of the President's Deficit Commission, Erskine Bowles, a university president who knows the effect of the budget crisis has had on our states, on education and on families, has spoken out against this irresponsible tax deal for wealthy Americans.
Senator's time has expired.
Mr. President, we should be voting on a plan that's a compromise, negotiated in good faith, based on the realities of our economy and not a date on the calendar. And that's what I wish we were doing. But I sincerely feel that the bad choices made in the last decade will haunt us through the next decade. For these reasons, the legislation before us today is a step too far, and that is why I oppose it. I yield the floor.